Hey everyone, welcome to the Grad Coach podcast. My name's Derek, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ethar, one of our trusty coaches. And we're going to be talking about 4 cheat codes that you can use to fast track your literature review. If you're currently working on a literature review, you definitely want to watch this. Also, you probably want to grab a copy of our free literature review template over on the Grad Coach blog. You can find the link to that in the description. So without further delay, let's get this party started. Ethar, welcome to the pod.
Welcome to it. Thank you for having me.
All right, so cheat code number 1 is to use your research aims and your research questions to optimize your literature search. There's a lot of big words there. There's a lot of jargon there. What is a literature search, and what are we doing when we talk about using your research aims and research questions to optimize this search?
So it sounds a lot more stressful than it is, but it's a relatively straightforward idea. In terms of the literature search, all we're really talking about is the use of the databases that you might expect, or the search engines that you might expect, to be able to find the literature that you need for the purposes of your literature review. Those are things like Google Scholar, JSTOR, Web of Science, Web of Knowledge, or your university's academic database. Any of those are just like any typical search engine. You just type in either the keywords that you're looking for or key terms you're looking for, and then it will just bring you up a list of all the research that it thinks is appropriate for what you've just searched. That being said, often what that will do is produce thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of results, which means you're then going to have to trawl through all of that information and try to figure out what does and does not relate to your research aims, research questions, or your topic generally speaking, to make sure you've got that alignment and golden thread running the whole way through your work. Well, a shorthand way of doing this is using the language in your research questions specifically to inform the search terms that you'll use when you're looking for your literature. And I mean this in almost literal terms. So whatever your research questions might happen to be, you'll use the keywords within that research question and type those into your library database, academic library database, and see what results come up. And what that should mean is that the results that do come up in the first instance will be much, much more refined than just a broad open-ended search, but it will also mean that they're very, very, very closely related to your particular concerns and avoids the risks of superfluity and talking on the fringes of your research. It means that everything is going to be directly focused on what it needs to be, so you can be that much more confident about the research that you're citing and what you're going to be talking about in your lit review.
It's so easy to get distracted and to digress in your literature review. You know, there's so much literature that you're going to be looking at. It's so easy to just digress and to read not necessarily too much, but to write too much, because you've just got so much literature that you're trying to cover. And so your research aims and your research questions are not only a way to fast track that reading process, but also to just make sure that you really stay on track and that you stay focused, because literature reviews do tend to digress and do tend to go off topic. So use your research aims and use your research questions, perhaps even your research objectives, to optimize that literature search. So on to cheat code number 2, and that is to plan out a loose structure of some sort before you start writing. Dr. E, why is this so important, and what do we mean by structure? What do students need to do here?
All right, so this is where it starts to get really interesting, because the idea is increasingly to start to try to use the rules and regulations about how to write projects and essays and papers and academic writing, generally speaking, to your advantage. One of those things is, exactly as we're mentioning, a structure up front. And we can kind of link that to the research questions that you were using previously to try to identify the appropriate literature. So one of the things that you could do, I'm not saying that you have to in every single case, but one thing one could do is in structuring your literature review, that's to say, preparing what it is that you're going to write and where you're going to write it or what you're going to write about, you could again use the information that you've taken from your literature search as well as your research questions to try to determine what your topics and subtopics should be in your literature review ahead of time. So what that means is that you know that the start of your literature review is going to include an introduction. You know that your literature review is going to go through the major topics that you need to discuss to cover your research. And you know your literature review is going to include a conclusion, roughly speaking. So the only area of ambiguity is the main body of the work. That's to say, the main sections where you're going into the work that relates to your research. And if that's being informed by your research questions, that's to say, not necessarily using them word for word as titles or subtitles, but being informed by them, so roughly the same thing, and using the literature that you found from those research questions as well to inform the input in that part of the literature review too, it should make the process a lot easier, because it means that before you start writing, and again, before you see that dreaded blinking cursor on a blank page, you've already got a sense of what you're going to write and when you're going to write it.
The dreaded blinking cursor, yeah, the struggle of every student.
Yeah, that thing.
This initial outline is just such an underestimated asset to any student's writing process. So often students are either faced with the challenge of not knowing what to write, or having, 1,000 things spinning around in their heads and not knowing where they go with this. And as a result, they just land up with this massive lump, this seething mess of a literature review. And so again, that issue of staying focused, staying on track, this rarely gets solved by having some sort of outline up front. And this doesn't need to be detailed. This can just be a set of bullet points. You can be jotting things down. You can go into as little or as much detail as you like, but have something that you're going to work with. And keep in mind that you're not committed to this thing. If you find that you're writing halfway through your literature review and you feel that actually I kind of forgot about that and I forgot about this and we need to move things around, that's completely fine. But it's better to be restructuring while you're writing, rather than trying to develop a structure while you're just thought vomiting or word vomiting text onto paper. So very important. All right, so on to cheat code number 3 for your literature review. This is a biggie, and that is that you want to aim for analytical writing as opposed to descriptive writing. Now, again, some big words here, some technical words. What do these things mean, and how do students ensure that they are focusing on the analytical as opposed to the descriptive?
I mean, it's a question that comes up really often. Kind of disappointing how often the question comes up, considering you'd think that should be the only thing that we're concerned with. And the myth is the distraction of the terminology. So when we're talking about analytical writing or critical analysis, often you'll hear these phrases used interchangeably, and they ultimately mean the same thing. The key issue here is the variation of what we're talking about, as you said, between descriptive writing and analytical writing, or critical analysis or critical writing. And you can find our blog post on this issue, and they talk about the same thing there. But the key issue, or the key terms that you want to familiarize yourself with, is this idea that in descriptive writing, we're really just talking about what happened. So it's more kind of like a linear progression of the events, or a description, as it were, of what occurred in this particular phenomenon that we're talking about. When you're talking critically, or we're thinking analytically, it's the so what, as opposed to what next. And in the so what we're talking about here principally is, what's the impact? Or what's the significance? What's the meaning? What's the value of the point that we're observing? And particularly when we're talking about research projects, is what's its impact, significance, and value to our research questions and our research aims. So it's not just a broad analysis of, okay, well, what does this statement mean generally speaking in life? Or what does this statement mean generally speaking to this topic? But it's a much more specific issue of, well, what does this statement mean? Or what does this claim mean? Or what are these stats and what does this data mean specifically with respect to my research aim and my research questions? And that should start you in the process of picking apart statistics, data, quotes, and claims made by other sources and getting you into that critical analysis.
So true. And I think, as you've clearly said, this distinction between what happened or what is and so what does this mean for the research question? This is so important, but I think what a lot of students misunderstand once they make that distinction is that then they must only write analytically. And that would also be a misunderstanding, because you need some description, you need to state the what in order to state the so what. And so a mistake can happen in sort of 2 flavors here, where students only discuss the so what, and then the reader's kind of going, well, how did you draw that conclusion? What's the basis of your argument there? Or more commonly, they just describe the what. They just say, well, this author said this and this author said that, and just nothing further. No therefore, no, consequently this or that. So it's really important to aim for the analytical, but make sure that, of course, that you're still building on a foundation of descriptive throughout your literature review.
So this all sounds a bit fluffy, a bit conceptual, a bit theoretical. So let's try and break this down to some real world terms in terms of what we mean with the difference with descriptive versus analytic or critical writing. So to give you just an example. Typically what might happen when you're doing your literature review, or what we see happening very often, is you'll just compile a list of what other authors have said in the area that you're interested in. And perhaps you're doing this even if you are using your research questions to guide the information. So you found 2 or 3 sources that specifically say things that perhaps confirm your suspicions or confirm your intentions or confirm your research aim. And you feel good about that because it means it's being validated by 2 or 3 other sources. And you can say that Johnson 2019 said such and such, and Mary Lefkowitz 2012 said such and such, and whatever it might happen to be. And you cite all of those sources and say that they all confirm whatever that belief is or whatever that research aim is that you're pursuing. But even in the instances where there's absolute 100% alignment between yourself and the research or the literature that you're looking at, or that's to say, even when you find those cases where you fully agree with one another, even that instance presents an opportunity for some meaningful critical or analytic writing or critical analysis. Because in that instance, you'd ask yourself the so what. Namely, well, even if it's the case that all of my sources tend to completely agree with either my data or my assumptions or my research aims or questions, well, there's a question as to why that might be the case. So what? If everybody agrees with you, well, so what that everybody agrees with you? What does it mean that everybody should agree? Because it's interesting that, for example, you might happen to find 3 or 4 different sources from 3 or 4 different places, perhaps in the United States and Europe or different places across the globe, and at 3 or 4 different times, one published in 2012, one published in 2019, one published in 2020, but they all seem to say exactly the same thing or all find perfect alignment with one another, including yourself. I mean, that suggests something. There's a so what here that's significant. And the implication is either we're all adopting a method that seems to be not paying any attention to the variations in time and space, or the subject that we're studying really doesn't change over time and space. But in either case, there is certainly a so what here to take into consideration, even in those cases where you find perfect alignment between yourself and your sources. Often the easiest way to think about the so what is where there's difference. But in this case, it could still work. So that critical writing or the analytic writing is really, really, really important in terms of just pushing your literature review forward and figuring out the things that make it matter most.
So true, so true. It's very tempting when we find just perfect agreement in the literature to just go, okay, therefore it must be true. But there's always a fly in the ointment if one looks close enough. So do ensure that you think critically, even when everyone agrees. And when they don't agree, that's even more exciting, because then that presents potentially a research gap. And so your argument could be that this group of researchers found X, but contrasted to that, this group of researchers found Y, presenting some sort of research gap that this isn't quite settled. And so whatever the case may be, whether you're finding a lot of agreement or a lot of disagreement, draw your conclusion, say, so what, therefore this, therefore that. All right, so on to our 4th and final, last but not least, cheat code for writing your literature review, and that is to use quote sandwiches. What exactly does this mean? What is a quote sandwich?
All right, so you have to forgive me. This is not like a technical term. It's not a term you're going to find in the textbooks, and if you go and Google this, you're going to get some really weird results. So if that happens, don't blame me. I didn't do that. And yes, I was hungry at the time when I came up with it. I apologize. We worked too much. Like, what do you want from me? But long and short, the quote sandwiches are really the part that I get the most excited about. And a quote sandwich is what happens when you follow the unwritten rule of introducing any quotation that you use from any source, and then following that quotation with an explanatory sentence. So what you're doing effectively is sandwiching the quotation that you're taking with an introductory sentence, and then following that with an explanatory sentence. So you've got like the 2 pieces of bread, as it were, your introductory and explanatory sentences around the quote, which is the meat of your sandwich, or the cucumbers if you're a vegetarian, but you get my point. So the idea here is that what it means is that in every single case, you can ensure that whenever you know you're going to use a quote or use a reference or a citation to a particular source, you can build in ahead of time those phrases that you know are relatively generic, expected, the things that you're supposed to be doing. So to give you an example of what that might look like, typically if I'm quoting a source, before I cite the source or before I quote the source themselves, you might say something like, Johnson 2019 in his paper said the same thing, ... And then you'd go into the quotation from the source. And then following the quotation from the source, you might say something like, therefore, at least in this case, Johnson believes that, yada, 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 whatever the end of that sentence is. Now, the advantage here is that neither of these sentences need to be perfectly completed. You don't necessarily have to have a finished introductory sentence or a finished explanatory sentence at this stage. You will, of course, do that further down the line. But when you're busy making a structure and an outline and planning what your literature review is going to look like, it's really, really helpful to plug those quote sandwiches in ahead of time. So one, it gives you a sense of the direction. You know which quotes you're working towards before you have to then move on to your main points. But two, those generic, predictable sentences are already there for you. So you don't have to waste too much time worrying about how I'm going to do that or making sure it's done. This way you can focus all of your attention on the critical analysis or on the focus points of your research. That's to say the issues in your literature review that make that literature review stand out and make it significant. So using those quote sandwiches just means it gives you that little bit of an advantage. And since we know it's an unwritten rule, we plug it in ahead of time, make it really easy for ourselves. And there you go. Now you can have an actual sandwich while you're writing a lit review. See?
So true. Quite often we see these literature reviews where a student has dropped in a quote and just expected that this quote's going to speak for itself, that it's just going to, create that aha moment in the reader's mind. And I think it's sort of a takeaway perhaps from less academic types of writing in books, especially self-help and business books. There'll just be these sprinkles of quotes and motivational quotes here and there. And that's not how it works in academia. You need to provide a bit of an introduction to that quote, and then you need to draw your conclusion from it. This really links into our previous point about critical versus descriptive, where, if you're just dropping the quote in, that's really just describing the quote. Whereas if you're actually introducing it and then drawing some conclusion from it, you're getting a bit more analytical. So stick to the sandwiches. Nice invention there, Doctor.
I mean, it's what I do. This is light work. This is a little bit, it's just a sandwich. It's an entry part of the meal. We haven't even got to the main course yet. You wait until you get to the rest of our coach class. Just bring a hungry stomach. We'll be fine.
Right. So to recap, the 4 little cheat codes that we have covered in today's episode is: number 1, to use your research aims and research questions to optimize your literature search or to lead your literature search. Number 2, to plan out some sort of structure before you start writing. The before is the emphasis there. Number 3 is to aim for the analytical as opposed to the descriptive. And how could we forget number 4, to make use of those quote sandwiches. So Dr. Ethar, thank you so much for sharing your cheat codes with us. And I'm sure they'll be very, very useful to all of our students.
Pleasure to be of service. I mean, this is what Dr. E does. It's just a little bit, as you said, it's a little bit of light work or a little bit of a coach cast and a little bit of an introduction to how to break down those lit reviews. But there's much, 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 much more to this. The key thing is the understanding that it's a generic process. There's a straightforward way to do this. And what we want to do is to take away all the concerns, all the worries about all of those formalities and focus your attention on what makes your particular research project unique, stand out, and effective. That's really the key issue.
All right, so that wraps up this episode. Remember, if you are currently working on a literature review, you can grab a copy of our popular literature review template. That's completely free, and you can get it on the Grad Coach blog. You can find the link to that in the description. If you got value from this video, please do hit the like and subscribe buttons, and you'll definitely want to check out this one next. See you there.